All right, I'll give some context, and there we go. Give some context for the show. The program will be kind of, I like to do things kind of informal, so I think we'll start with just kind of an introduction to what the exhibit itself is and what motivated it. Then we're going to do 10 minutes each for the folks who are, oh, yay, hi. 10 minutes each for the folks who are here sitting as panelists. And they're going to be sharing a little bit about the impact, basically, of waiting for beds and how that's manifested in their lives. And then following everybody speaking and giving that sort of background, then I think we'll sort of like go back and forth between just opening it up to questions and comments in the audience. And if there aren't any specific things that you guys want to ask, I have a whole list of fun things to ask, so I'm prepared. But yeah, essentially, so this exhibit started as an idea between myself and Carla Hamilton. She's the other main artist who organized this. I can't remember the exact conversation that led to the actual implementation of the show, but basically I'd been going through some stuff as far as being a caretaker in my family and trying to navigate systems for a loved one who continuously was faced with being told that she had to wait for a bed in order to get help. And I've also worked in a domestic violence shelter. I used to work at the Dabanuigan Domestic Violence Shelter at ACO. And so I'd kind of been on the other side too, telling people, like, I think the year that I worked there, we turned away 500 different women who were fleeing domestic violence. And that was just because we only had, I think, 8 beds at the time, between 8 and 15. And so thinking about that phrase, waiting for beds, and in my work as an artist, I like to look at phrases or words that I think get normalized, that we don't pay attention to, but that are at the root of major issues in the community. And so like waiting for beds was just like this red flag. And essentially it's a term that gets used when you for people in crisis, basically. And so a lot of the time people who are seeking shelter, people who are fleeing domestic violence. Audio good? Okay. People who are seeking shelter, people who are fleeing domestic violence. It's a phrase that's used in foster care. We heard it during COVID when there was ICU beds that weren't open. It's a phrase in mental health care, and in recovery and addiction services. And so it's basically what you get told when there's no space for you in the middle of your emergency. And so we wanted to bring together the perspectives of caretakers and as well as people with lived experience. So Carla has and comes to this with her experience having an eating disorder and navigating systems as an African-American woman, going through institutions and mental health care and things like that in her journey. And then we decided to bring in data. So we took a look at basically trends that are happening with bed waits across all of those different areas of crisis at a national level, a statewide level, a countywide level, and then Duluth specifically, and sort of pulled out some demographics too that are specifically hard hit in this issue. And then also sent out a survey, got stories from people, which are kind of collected and spread out throughout the data. And then behind me is a bunch of community submissions we got in a really rapid call for art and objects. So I know Jesse and Airlea, you have, they have 2 pieces that are here that they can talk a little bit more about. The inspiration was kind of this box that's kind of in the corner that was basically for the person that I was trying to support. They gave me this box, and I was kind of fascinated with the objects inside of it. Because if you were to see them outside of the context of the box, they just look like trash. There's like a broken glasses lens and like these like bra wires, and things like that, little notes and candy and stuff like that they got collected during their time in treatment. And just an example of like one of the stories of those objects this person didn't have access to optical care inside treatment. And so in order to see, she had to use this single like eyeglass lens that was popped out of her glasses, and that was how she would see. And so like just a little object like that holds a huge story. So I think after this or at some point, if you come back, I definitely encourage people to look at the community submissions. This exhibit goes till April 14th, and it will come down after that and go to Grand Rapids McCroskey Art Center. It'll open May 5th, so I'll probably put out another call for community submissions and see what happens there. Yeah. And yeah, I'm Moira Villiard. I'm a visual artist. And so I guess we could probably just go in the order of how everybody's sitting at the table. Sure. If you guys want to take 10 minutes roughly each, and I don't know, I'll just kind of. I hope this fills up 10 minutes. Yeah. And just like what your connection to waiting for beds is, and I guess what brought you to this space today too.
Okay. Buju, Gakna, Awia, Pitoe, Yashiko, Indigenous Cause, Makwa, Indogrim, Nagachwanang, and Nujma, Anagabi singing that. Hi, my name is Airlea Defoe. I am enrolled in Fond du Lac, and I'm from Duluth pretty much. I came down here when I was a foster kid at the age of 12 or 13, and have pretty much been here ever since. So yeah, I am a mother, student, community event organizer, and a recovering addict. I actually just celebrated my 6 year sobriety anniversary last Sunday, and thank you. I actually celebrated my sobriety anniversary in the same place that I got arrested in, which was at my foster mom's. I got arrested on her porch, and she never even knew. I had to tell her after. But at the time of my arrest, I was homeless, dirty. I hadn't slept in I don't know how long, and I had been running the streets, basically homeless, for over a year at that point. And was pretty much on like the ultimate bender. When I finally met with my probation officer after being arrested, I pretty much begged her to let me out. Like I really got down on my knees and was like, please let me out. And she refused. I cried, I screamed at her, I got angry, and she was still like, no, this is it. Mostly I was afraid of withdrawing in jail. But yeah, instead of letting me out like she did on various occasions before, she decided to save my life that day and keep me in jail. She gave me a UA, and I tested positive for literally every drug on the panel. I had been doing meth, heroin, pills, and weed, and even acid. Basically just anything that I could get my hands on at that point. When my probation officer asked me how I was still alive, I was like, I don't know, and I pretty much just wondered the same thing. I wondered why the Creator didn't take me, although he had had countless opportunities. I wondered why my many brushes with death never procured my desired outcome. I was in a place where I couldn't bring myself to kill myself, but I definitely didn't want to be alive anymore. So before my final arrest, I had been arrested and gone to treatment on various occasions. I would say that I started feeling that like itch to get sober about 6 months before I actually did get sober. That fall before my arrest, I had both overdosed and gotten kicked out of the place that I was staying at. I really just didn't have, there was nowhere, that was my last place to stay. There was nowhere left to go after that. I assaulted the woman who I was staying with, and for obvious reasons, she kicked me out. And not long before that, I had overdosed in her bathroom. And the main thing I remember from that experience is getting transported to the ambulance. And when I got to the hospital, I woke up from my overdose, and my I was in the ambulance and I got to the hospital and I had all these like stickers all over my chest and like these beepers and these wires hanging off of me. And there was a police officer with me and he was asking me like, where did you get the drugs? And then he had to go to the bathroom and I just ripped all the stickers off and booked it out the door. And went home to get high some more. So after I got kicked out, my life immediately blew up more than it already blew up. Actually, hang on, I turned a page too fast. Yeah, I started getting arrested more and more. I was always out in the cold weather, just like walking around looking for Wi-Fi to see if I could message somebody and like maybe they would let me come over. I even went to treatment twice, and it sounds pretty counterintuitive, but as soon as I had that first thought of getting sober, my life just like instantly became increasingly more miserable. After becoming homeless again, I knew that I couldn't live that lifestyle anymore, but I didn't know how to stop, so I figured I would just die. But obviously I never did. Honestly, I think that the absolute lowest point in my life was the period of time right before I got sober. It was winter, I was always cold, I was always sick, I was always hungry, people were constantly turning me away. People I had been friends with for years didn't really want to associate with me anymore because I didn't have anything to offer. I would like knock on a person's door and they would turn me away because I didn't have money or dope or I didn't want to have sex with them. And yeah. So I would go to jail again and deal with like the most intense withdrawals for a few days, and then I would get out and then I would use again, and it just like started being a cycle. And sometimes like going to jail almost felt like a relief because like I was so cold and hungry and stuff out here that it, you know, like I would be sick, but at least I would go and like eat for a few days and be warm. So after a while, my probation officer decided that I needed treatment, but it never really worked out. And I actually remember each time I found out I was going to treatment, I was elated. I was super excited to finally be finding an escape from like this black hole that I was living in. But eventually the excitement always faded and turned into fear. The longer I waited for my bed to open up, the less I felt like going. And when my bed finally would open up, I just didn't want to go anymore. I think that this is the most important concept in my whole speech and the reason I'm speaking here today. I didn't want to go to treatment. I didn't want to go to treatment because by the time a bed opened up, my life had already moved on. While it might not seem like much of a life, it was pretty much all I had ever known. Every acquaintance, friend, all my daily activities, my sole purpose for living, all revolved around heroin. So of course I didn't want to be sick anymore, and of course I was tired of being arrested and homeless and dirty and cold, but it's not enough. I didn't know that life could be anything else besides what it was. So when I found out I was going to treatment, I would feel excited, ecstatic, and even hopeful, but as time went on and I waited for my bed, my life had to go on. I had to keep living, I had to keep chasing drugs to avoid the sickness in the meantime. I had to keep seeing the people I always saw and go to the places that I always went because there was nothing else. And pretty soon you're living your life and you forget that you're going to treatment and the day arrives, but you have a million other important things to do that day. Looking back at it, all these important things seem rather trivial now, but at the time, that was what my whole life consisted of. I always went to I did always go to treatment when my bed would open up. But like by that time, I was just so over it that I would get in there and then I would sabotage it. When you spend every day of your life in survival mode, the days kind of stretch on forever. So getting sober was something that seemed like it was like light years in the past. What might feel like a month to me now previously felt like years in the past, especially considering that addicts get very little sleep. Getting sober was a pipe dream that never came into fruition. Getting sober was something that I wanted on a day that I didn't have a jacket, or I got left at Walmart, or I was walking around with nowhere to go, puking from my withdrawals. But getting sober was not something that I wanted when I had an ounce in my pocket, or a working vehicle, or a place to stay for the night. The feeling of wanting to get sober is not constant. It's not something that you feel all the time. Sometimes you want to, and sometimes you don't. Giving up my whole life and everything I ever knew was one of the scariest experiences of my life, and that decision literally happens in a split second. That's why the period of time when somebody is waiting for a bed is so crucial, because anything can change at any time. People can decide that they don't want to use drugs anymore one day, but be unable to deal with the sickness the next day. People can be homeless walking around on the streets one day and find a place to stay the next day. And people can even crash their car and steal a new one the next day. When you're an addict, no 2 days look the same. Every day is different, and every day brings something new. Every day brings an opportunity to get sick, get rich, or even die. And each one of these opportunities can affect the way a person feels about treatment. Would you want to leave your life behind if you felt like you were sitting on $100,000? But let's say, why is this not right? There it is. But let's say somebody stole that $100,000 from you, and you spent the whole next day thinking about how you were gonna get it back, or you're just sick. You're riddled with anxiety. Like, somebody stole $100,000 from you. Come on now. And you can't think of anything else besides this. But just when you think about, like, you're gonna give up, like, screw that $100,000, just forget it, or, you know, whatever you decide. You might even decide you want to kill yourself. Who knows? But then the next day, you found a different way to make $100,000, and everything is fine again. And, you know, there's no reason to go, or there's no reason to go to treatment. So, but yeah, then you die because your $100,000 was laced with fentanyl. Fortunately, on my third attempt at treatment, I was able to get sober and stay sober, but honestly, I feel like a large part of that was the fact that this time I had to wait for my bed while I was in jail. So I waited for months while I was in jail, and yeah, the excitement to go literally anywhere else besides jail just continued to grow. At that time in my life, going to treatment meant receiving more freedom, better food, better blankets, better bed, just like a better everything. So of course I wanted to go. My time in jail allowed me to completely withdraw, giving me clarity of mind, and it gave me the necessary space I needed from my old lifestyle. I couldn't self-sabotage, and most importantly, I couldn't escape. Treatment was my only escape, so I did it, and now I'm here to talk to you about my experience with waiting for beds. Thank you.
Oh my God, that was amazing.
Thank you.
Just amazing. Okay. We're in for like so much amazingness today. I'm just, yeah, I'll let Sam, if you want to take 10 minutes and.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Sam, and I feel really grateful to be here to be able to share my story and have all of us talk amongst ourselves and find some commonality and hopefully a path forward that is one that is a healthy path forward. So my story in regards to waiting for a bed is that I have 3 different diagnoses. I have paranoid schizophrenia. I was recently diagnosed in the past year with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I suffer from anxiety. I was 22 years old, which is like, if you averaged out the time period for when a man like is gonna have a psychotic event, it's like perfect. It was like the perfect storm. So I had a major psychotic event when I was 22 years old. I was living with my parents until I was 21. I'm a professional musician, so I would go out on the road and I would play, and then my mailing address was 28996 Clearwater Road, north of Grand Rapids, about 15 miles. And I had some what I would call glimmers of psychotic experience as a young person. You know, like an example would be out in my parents' yard, walking in circles, talking to God, having conversations, screaming at the sky out loud, you know. But I could always kind of rein things back in. I had some what they call adverse childhood experiences. When I was 10 years old, my brother died. He was 22 years old when he died. He was a star athlete running the decathlon for UC Davis out in California. And he had a cardiomyopathy, which is, he suffered sudden athlete death, which is, I think it was Damar Hamlin. What he suffered, my brother suffered, and he didn't survive it. That happened when I was 10 years old. When I was 13, we had a major house fire, and our home burned to the ground. It was a place that my dad had built. And after those two events, my dad suffered a sort of severe break from post-traumatic stress disorder. He's a U.S. Marine. Served from 1968 to 1970 in Vietnam, was stationed in the An Hoa Valley and saw combat for 2 years, 2 13-month tours. And when he lost his son and he lost his home, which was his sanctuary, he built the house himself. I think he wanted to find a little space away from the rest of the world where he could be safe. And he lost his son. And he lost his sanctuary, and to me it was almost like I lost my dad because he kind of lost his mind. So surviving that experience was pretty challenging, but I channeled all of my energy into my art, which is jazz guitar, improvised music, and it was working really well for me until I was 21. But there was sort of I think, a gradual building effect towards the age of 22, where I didn't actually expect to live past 22 because my brother had died at 22. In my mind, I thought that I was going to die at 22. You know, one of my decisions to be a musician and to not go into, you know, pursue a higher education was I couldn't stand the idea that these few short years I had left, I'd have to be in school. I wanted to be playing guitar, and I loved to hunt and fish, and I wanted to be in the woods. So when I hit 22, I had moved to the Twin Cities to be with my now wife, Katie, and it sort of started to manifest itself with just these crying fits that I didn't understand why they were happening. I was taking some classes at MCTC because I was trying to get with the program, go to community college, get a degree, and I was living away from home for the first time and gigging full time, so there was a lot of stress put on me. And one of the things we know is people who have a genetic predisposition to psychotic illnesses, that environmental factors can exacerbate that, and stress is a known trigger for people with psychotic illnesses. So I started to have these delusions. It was the year that the I-35W bridge collapsed, and I was convinced, because I had moved to the cities at the same time, that I was responsible for the bridge collapse. And I felt as though that I was some kind of like higher deity. I might not have been the God, but I might have been a God responsible for this horrific event. So I eventually came to this belief that in order for me to save the world, I had to end my life. My logic was I needed to end my life to save the world because I was responsible for all of this. So it culminated in a trip to a psychologist who said she was my girlfriend then, my wife, she said, this guy needs, serious help. Something is going on here. And they said, we should hospitalize him. And she said, well, she knew me. And she said, this is not going to work for this guy. And she said, I have a family cabin up in Grand Rapids where we're both from. We're going to go up there. And so she took me up there, and then it was just clear that I had to stay in Grand Rapids area. I needed to be, she was working at the time, and I needed to have some level of supervision. So we started seeking help through Northland Counseling Center in Grand Rapids, and back to the waiting for a bed. It took months before I could even get an initial appointment to be assessed in Grand Rapids. It was months that I would have to wait to do that. When I was assessed, it was a question of you can either go to the Hibbing Psych Ward and be on a 72-hour hold, or you can be part of what's called a PHP, which is a partial hospitalization program. So it's a longer span. So instead of 3 days in the psych ward, it was 2 or 3 weeks doing this partial hospitalization program. So I got into that program and I was further assessed, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And so there was suicidal ideation at the beginning of that. And then the other serious problem that I had is because of my insurance, I could not afford medications. My medications cost over $1,000 a month, and I couldn't afford it, so I would go to the mental health clinic and I would get samples from like AstraZeneca reps that were coming, and so they would hand them to me in a brown paper bag stapled shut and hand me the meds, and I'd take them home and take my meds. And the other struggle was, it was here in Duluth, in St. Louis County, that I applied for Social Security disability. I think it took 3 tries before I was able to get Social Security disability, which included Medicare. And so that's how I have my medical insurance. And then I was able to afford, the prescription medications that weren't, free samples out of the clinic or whatever. So that was kind of the initial struggle, was to just even get medication, to even get in to get an appointment. And then as time progressed, I recovered substantially. Like they thought I might have depression with psychotic features. They gave me antidepressants and I became more psychotic, which is really common for people with schizophrenia. They gave me antipsychotics and all of a sudden I didn't think I was a god that needed to kill himself. And my paranoia went away. The other thing that I experienced was delusions are the primary issue with me, but it was like a gradient. Like if this is health, the further down the ladder I would go, at the very bottom it was hearing voices, and I did have some visual hallucinations as well. And the way I can describe schizophrenia is it's like an unending, horrific acid trip that you can't get off. Some people, they'll take a drug and have this experience. I have to take a drug to not have this experience. And it's a really terrifying, frightening thing. But I recovered so much that I thought, I don't think I really have this. I don't think I really need these medications, which apparently is a very common thing. And so I never went off my meds, but I went low enough that they just weren't therapeutic. And I had a second psychotic event. And I think I wound up in the emergency room 4 times for that. But I learned the magic words, and I was telling Miri I could work the system, because I could say, as psychotic as I was, I'd say, I'm not gonna hurt anyone, I'm not gonna hurt myself. Right. And then they'd go, dang it, we just about got him. Because that's how you would get a bed, is if you were a danger to yourself or someone else. And that was the only way that you could get in for treatment into Hibbing, into the 5th floor at the psych ward. And so I went through another psychosis, and looking at these statistics here, one of the statistics was I was picked up by the cops. I was having a psychotic event at my house. I had 2 different issues surrounding suicide, and I didn't actually attempt it, but I got close. I was in my bathrobe and a pair of rubber boots, and I drove up north of Chisholm, Minnesota, and found an old building, and I was so tired of taking the medications, I was going to just take them all, and then everyone would be happy. I took my meds, right? So I got talked off the edge by the crisis intervention worker in Grand Rapids, and I drove home, and when I got there, the law enforcement was there, and I can still remember, he had his hand on his gun, and it was like, I can run, or I can freak out, and I'm gonna get tased or shot, or I can go along with this and go to the emergency room. And so I went to the emergency room. So that was my experience with law enforcement. But that was like the threshold where I said, okay, you do have this. You have schizophrenia. You have to address it. You have to deal with it. This is sort of an aside, but it does tie into mental health. 4 years ago, I wound up losing all the hearing in my left ear. I'm functionally deaf in my left ear. And for a professional musician to lose half of their sense was a serious issue, and it created post-traumatic stress. And so I haven't slept without a nightmare, even with medication, for 4 years. So that's kind of my connection to it. And then just one last side note is this psychotic illness is like bipolar and schizophrenia is just very clearly genetic. I have an aunt who has bipolar. I have another aunt who has schizoaffective disorder, cousin who has bipolar, another cousin who has schizophrenia, and addiction mixed in with all of that. So now I have 2 family members in crisis, one of which because I know the mental health system and Itasca County, I am helping to facilitate help for this loved one. And so now I'm seeing, because I've recovered enough, I'm seeing the flip side of the coin of what people were doing for me. So it's weird because I'm having like these, I have to have some boundaries so I don't like delve into it too deeply. So anyways, I'm gonna pass the time on here, and thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jesse. I am an illustrator, I'm a cartoonist, and I'm a recovered alcoholic. You know, when I think about waiting for beds, I think about a few things. Off the top of my head, I can't help but think about my 2 experiences trying to get into a treatment bed when I was in my active addiction. Another thing I think about is our corrections, our Department of Corrections, and our criminal justice system. I know you were just talking about that. And I think about how like closely intertwined it seems that addiction ends up with people who are incarcerated in prisons and in jails. And then I also think about the statistics. I mean, the walls are lined with them right now. But roughly every year, there's like 20 million people in this country who suffer from some sort of addiction, alcoholism, or another substance use disorder. And in my research, I found that only about 13% of these people are actually getting any sort of treatment or therapy for that. So a lot of professionals agree that 30 to 90 days in an inpatient facility for mental health treatment or addiction recovery services is kind of the optimal baseline to start trying to build a framework to turn your life around, to start leading down a path of recovery and sobriety, long-term sobriety. And that 13%, that only accounts for the people that have gotten any sort of therapy or treatment for it. So no one knows the exact number of how small the amount of people are that actually get that needed 30 to 90 days of inpatient treatment. So, you know, I can't talk about waiting for beds without touching on my story. 2 different situations, 2 different financial situations especially, and it was totally different. The difference between trying to get in is night and day if you don't have any financial resources. So my story with addiction started when I was about 18 years old. I had my first panic attack when I was driving down the freeway in traffic. And I started to learn that I had childhood trauma, I had anxiety, I had a lot of shame and guilt built up from a really harsh, conservative Christian upbringing. And I learned that, you know, having a drink at the end of the day or going to a party and having one made things a lot easier. I could look people in the eye, I could talk to them, I could be myself, I could feel comfortable in my own skin. Now that led me down a path over the next 5-6 years where once in a while turned into every night, and every night turned into in the morning sometimes. And then one thing led to another, and I started pushing away the people that were important to me. I started not being present in my family life, in my work life, and it got to a point when I had pushed enough people away that I decided that I wanted to get help for this. And I had heard of treatment before. I didn't have the first idea how to get in. So I remember it was an early December night, and I had been drinking all day, and I decided that I had had enough. And the first person I decided I needed to call was my dad. I'm forever grateful for my dad because I think about everyone who suffers from a substance use disorder and they don't have a parent or someone close to them who can help them. The fact is that a lot of people who suffer from this have a family member or a parent that suffers from it as well. So reaching out for help to him was invaluable at that time. And it wasn't like it was 2 p.m. like now or anything like that. This was like 11 o'clock at night. And my dad and my stepmom, they sprang into action and they started writing down phone numbers, researching, finding what treatment centers they could call in Minnesota. And after a few hours of calling around, they found a place that had a bed open for me. So unfortunately for me, it wasn't a bed that was like 5 minutes down the road. I was in Minneapolis and there was no beds open. They called them all. And my dad had to travel 3 hours down to come pick me up. And we had to go to the southwest corner of the state to find the one bed in Minnesota that night that was open.
Wow.
So I went there, I did the 30-day treatment program. I did a halfway house. And I was able to string together 6 months of sobriety. And it was a good time in my life, you know, a lot of reflection. I learned a lot. But my anxiety and my trauma started to manifest itself in new ways that I wasn't familiar with. And like many addicts do, you know, I suffered a relapse. I ended up going back to drinking. And they say in recovery that your addiction, it's like in a state of arrest when you stop drinking. It doesn't matter how long it's been, the moment that you pick it back up. And it's no joke. A week later, I lost my job. A week later, I was getting in fights. I was pushing away friends and family all over again. And it culminated in a night that was supposed to be fun, a nice, fun social gathering in the summer. And it ended with me taking a swing at my brother, and got the cops called on me, and I ended up spending the night in jail. So not only did I get the night in jail, but I also got a year of probation. So I can't really talk about waiting for beds without also bringing up the ties between the Department of Corrections and people who need help with their addictions and with their mental health disorders. So I decided this next year on probation, I was just gonna fly under the radar, not make any waves, not piss anybody off. And you know, that year was the hardest year of my life. I mean, hands down, it was the most difficult, the most painful. As I fought to string together 3 weeks of sobriety here and a week there, I found myself bouncing from St. Cloud to Minneapolis until the person I was staying with was fed up with me, or I lost a job. And I would find my way to another couch, to another town. And after about a year, I had had enough. So I decided I was gonna do what my parents did this time, and I was gonna sit down, I was gonna call some mental health facilities and some treatment facilities, and I was just gonna call them, and I was gonna get into bed just like last time. What I found was, you know, I had about 3 days of sobriety, my head was clear just a little bit, and I ended up calling these places, and the answers I got from each one was pretty much the same. It was, you know, we don't have any beds right now. You know, maybe in a week or two, you know, we can add you to a list. I heard that a lot. I also heard, you know, you want us to call you back if something opens up. And I know that you mentioned earlier about how you have that moment of clarity. It's like such a precious ray of light in the darkness, and it's so swift and it's so fleeting that if you don't take action in that small window, the likelihood of you actually following through with anything, it just shrinks. And when you're in active addiction, you're living life pretty dangerously. So when that window shuts, you're right back to where you were. You're right in danger of, you know, losing your job, pushing away more people, dying from your use, having a negative altercation with law enforcement. All those things are a heightened risk when someone actually wants to get help. They see their picture as being bad enough that they need the help. So I decided, you know, I'm not gonna get help this way. You know, I tried, couldn't get anybody that had a bed open. And the one that did actually say, hey, you know, yeah, we have an opening, you know, can you get a ride down here? I told them I had insurance, I gave them my info, and then the next thing I know, they're asking me what my credit card number is. And they're like, we need $700 for you to come in. You know, if we can't take you in unless you have $700, we don't take cash.
An addict has $700 laying around.
I mean, when it's hard enough, you know, to make ends meet and to put a splash of fuel in your tank or to put food in the fridge. I mean, you don't have a month's worth of rent just laying around, just sitting around. So I decided, I mean, I'm just gonna maybe go to a couple 12-step meetings. Maybe if I do that, I'll maybe call the center downtown and see if maybe I can get into some outpatient treatment. But again, that window of clarity starts to shut, especially when you get turned away. And it wasn't a week later, I ended up back in my full alcoholic, you know, full use. It was just right back down the path again. But this time I had another quick moment of clarity. And I decided that enough was enough and that I wanted to get help any way that I could. So being on probation, you know, I was desperate. So I still remember that morning, March, it was 6 years ago, and I saw the rising sun coming through the window, and I decided that, you know what, if no treatment facility is gonna take me, then I'm gonna call someone who will. And I grabbed the business card that my probation officer left for me, and I decided to call her up. So I told on myself. I said, I've been drinking, I broke probation, I need help, I don't want to live like this anymore. And we agreed that I would turn myself in, and I got a ride down to the county. It was a couple counties over, so I finally got a ride there. And well, it was only about a week, and I had a bed. Got to jail, and about a week, I finally found a treatment bed. And this time around, they didn't ask me for $1,000 when I showed up. So I mean, the fact that I had to go to jail, I had to turn myself in order to get treatment, it just boggles my mind when I think about it. And I'm grateful that I was on probation, you know, that someone did call the cops on me that night. I was being a little too rowdy, because I don't know if I'd be here today. I'm really grateful that I had a dad who was able to at the drop of a dime, he was able to get up in the middle of the night, make phone calls, drive 3 hours across the state and bring me there. And he didn't even tell me until literally 2 months ago that when I went to that first treatment, he had to cut $1,000 check to them. And he never told me. He was never gonna tell me, you know, until we had a conversation about it later down the line. So I'm extremely grateful for that. You know, I ended up going into treatment 6 years ago. I ended up doing the 30-day program. I got out. I had a plan. I joined a regular 12-step group, and I started working my mental health, seeing a therapist. And I've been grateful for the 6 years of sobriety that I've had. I just celebrated it probably like a week, right within a week of yours. I don't know, something about spring is just magical, and I think there's something special about having a sobriety birthday in the spring. You know, you're turning over a new leaf. You're really building a new life. A lot of people who have been in addiction, it's night and day. You know, when you reach that point of long-term sobriety and the path of recovery, it's like you're an entirely different person. So I'm extremely grateful for the opportunities that I've had over the last 6 years to not only share my story, but to find a community with other people who have been through stuff that I've been through. You know, again, it's 20,000 people out there today, you know, this year that they're not gonna get help. You know, they're not gonna get the support they need. When you're in active addiction, you don't have $1,000 laying around, and those are the people that need the help the most. And it's quite simply, the support they need is inaccessible for them. It's a conversation that's really hard to have because it's layered by so many different factors with healthcare and with other hot button issues, but it's something that we have to start. So I'm really grateful for everyone here today who's willing to just listen to our story. Maybe you can think about, you know, the people in your life that may be experiencing things like this. Lastly, when we're in our recovery rooms, we talk about personal stories being the vessel for experience and for strength and for hope. And you know, we share our experience today not only to strengthen ourselves, but to help give strength to people who are still suffering. Anybody who knows anybody or is listening that's going through what we're going through, there is a way out. It's not easy, but there is a way out. And my hope is that in 10 years, you know, maybe even sooner, that when someone like me decides that they've had enough and they want to get help, that when they call that person on the other side of the line, that person isn't asking them for their credit card info. That person is just asking them, how soon can you get here? Yeah. So thank you guys, and with that I'll pass.
Oh boy, I don't know if it's good to go last. But no, I had a couple of revelations along the way, so I am gonna age myself, like, so Airlea. So yeah, I had kind of, I've been doing this as for, you know, work for a long time, but I'll tell you in a minute why I don't consider it work. When I heard Airlea say about overdosing and things like that, I was already doing outreach work in Minneapolis, and I've been in and out of treatment about 8 times before I started working at a shelter. Always in and out of using and stuff too. But then I got this job at a shelter, and I don't know, things started changing a little bit for me. Then I got this outreach position in St. Paul and started working with the homeless, and it was the first outreach position in St. Paul, so it was kind of crazy. It became my I turned my addiction into being a workaholic. And so then, but what happened is like, I think it was like 2001. I'd been doing this since about 1998, maybe. I'm aging myself. So I'm old. Not quite old enough to retire. But anyways, I had an overdose. I was 30 years old, and I was doing outreach. And by like some miracle, my friend, you know, if anybody knows the cities, my friend lived in Hopkins. I was in St. Paul. She's like, I haven't heard from Deb for, 24 hours. She knew I was on a binge. It's like, she came over there and whatever, next thing you know, I'm in an ambulance to Regions, and I remember them saying to me, oh, you tried to kill yourself, so we're gonna try to commit you. Will you sign a release for your sister? I'm like, no. And, but I said, no, that's just how I use, I mean, I knew how I used, so, I was not trying to kill myself, I was trying to get high. So, but at that moment, or a little later, I had a revelation that, my life was spared for a reason, and that was the reason, because I got to go back and do outreach again. So everybody I worked with threw me under the bus, and the people that were coming to visit me were my friends on the street. I'm like, cool. I mean, that's why I value those relationships so much, because those are the real relationships. And I mean, because I do this for work, I mean, I hate, if I was rich, I honestly would do it for free, because I feel like it's what we're supposed to do as humans, take care of each other. But what I see on a daily basis would drive a person crazy. I mean, when you talk about waiting for beds, and then I thought about something that you said too, Jesse. I mean, when I think of the times I was going to treatment, we could stay six months to a year. Like you could actually stay in treatment for a year and then do another 6 months in a halfway house. And right now, 30 days, 30 days and kick to the street does nothing except put somebody back in the spiral of addiction. I see so many people go to treatment, come back. It takes forever to get them there. Mostly just because of, their decision, it's kind of, oh, let's put it off a few days or whatever. But I think they can get in relatively quickly if you're in the system.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you're in the system, that's where it's quicker. But I mean, I can look at the jail roster and tell you that I know at least 10 people on the jail roster that are sitting there waiting for a Rule 20, which is a competency evaluation. And I even had a public defender email me last week and said there's no reason these guys should be sitting in jail waiting for this, People waiting in the psych ward that have been committed for a bed in a state facility. It's just, they should get to move a little faster. I mean, it's taking up, what happens is it takes up beds for our local folks, people in our family, people in our community that need that help right now. We do not have enough beds in this town. When I asked my boss about doing this, and I'm like, what do you think it's like looking for beds? She's like, it's frenzy. It's like a frenzy, and like especially for mental health, well, even CADT these days, getting somebody in detox, used to be able to get somebody in there like right on the spot, but now they're like, we're full, call back in an hour, and as part of it is they can't keep staff. It's a very stressful job. I mean, it's like, a lot of these guys get close to a lot of people that die. And I lost my train of thought at one blank, but yeah, it used to be you could just get in there, and now they even have, I think they have like 40 beds now with the capacity of maybe 50 once they're fully staffed. But people stay longer now because they're getting on MAT programs, medicated assisted treatment programs, like Suboxone or methadone or something. so that they're staying longer, so that's taking up, you know, a longer space for the bed. I know that, I just hate to call this work, but I do it for work, so I gotta call it work. I mean, you know, we all know the people in our community. We see them on the street that need mental health help. And me and the folks I work with every day, we watch those people, and we look for an opportunity to get them in the hospital. Because, you know, when you see, like what you said, you gotta be a danger to yourself or others. Well, I mean, I know many people that know that lingo, you know, and, but there's people that are so ill that, I mean, they probably wouldn't even be able to say that once they got there. But yet, people that are homeless, people that are in a, you know, like psychotic and doing drugs, well, they'll tell you, this is how I see it, they'll tell you that, well, they're high, you know, they're high. Although we know it's mental health, you know? No, they're high, we can't tell if it's mental health or drugs. Oh, bullshit. It's like, but they're gonna use that, they're high, and then kick them to the street. So, I don't think I should say my favorite hospital, but it is St. Luke's. For getting people the help they need. But it's kind of, I mean, we do have, you know, groups that, I mean, like, they got the downtown outreach worker now, I mean, it is nice to have more people that can help and keep an eye on folks and try to get them the help they need, because, I mean, I can't believe this gal finally got in on a medical reason, and I've been trying to get her in the hospital for probably 2 years. It's like one of the worst cases I've seen in town. Drugs, always drugs. This is drugs, this is drugs. No, this is both, mental health, you know. It's like, I don't know how they get away with it, but anyway, she's finally getting committed. And I'm not saying that I think people should get committed, but when people can't, when they're out there like that, and you've seen them, I'm sure you have, right? Have you seen them? It's like, I mean, I don't want to take away a person's civil liberties either, but when they're so ill like that, I mean, they're not safe. You know, they're doing harmful things, they're doing risky things, they're being exploited and taken advantage of, they might be being trafficked. They are in fact being trafficked, for sure. And just, yeah, the waiting for mental health beds is almost worse for me, just because there aren't any. And even with, even though we have this new crisis response team in town, I mean, we still don't have enough beds. So any of us can call the crisis response team, but everybody's heard of Birch Tree, right? Have you heard of Birch Tree? Yeah. So, I mean, you can call right now and say, I want to go to Birch Tree, and I'll bet you, they'll come down and do an assessment with you, or you'll go to them, whatever way you choose to do it. And then they gotta send the assessment up to Birch Tree, and like, maybe you'll know in 4 hours. Well, what are you gonna do I just feel like you gotta have access right now, because if it's me, I'm gonna get scared and probably walk away during those 4 hours or something. Same with any kind of bed I'm waiting for. So yeah, I just think we have to have access now. And there has to be a place to wait while you're waiting. Don't just kick people to the street. I know over at Essentia, they have, well, I don't care for the system, but, excuse me, guys. I mean, they just have, and they do have a place to hold you while you're waiting for a bed, but you can end up being there like a week or 10 days in this little hospital room, which is
A chair.
horrible. What's that?
It's a chair. It's just like a little chair.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's horrible. It's like horrible. It's just, and then what happens is we don't have enough beds in Duluth, so you get shipped off to somewhere like North Dakota or, Hibbing or Grand Rapids, and then if you do have services in Duluth, your service provider loses track of you because they don't tell the service provider where you're going. And, I don't wanna get too treatment focused here or anything. I mean, I'm not, but, yeah, we just don't have the capacity, and, everybody should be damn mad that Essentia added no mental health beds in their expansion, in their hospital expansion, so. Something we need desperately in this town, so. Boy, I swore about 3 times already in here. And just like I don't know, some of the, I've been here a long time, so I've been here since 2005. So, like all the officers I started with are now like lieutenants and stuff now. So for me, that's good because I kind of came up in the ranks with them. And, I mean, there's only one cop that I trust in this whole town. So it's like, I mean, explicitly.
Yeah.
So, and he knows it. I said, I bet you're disappointed in your lieutenant now, and you're my favorite cop. It's like, because I feel like I do have, I have a place to vent, and we'll get an honest answer. And if I can't get an answer, the truth will be told. I can't talk about that. But I don't know if everybody's probably been watching the paper or whatever. We are starting a behavioral health court. Have you seen that?
Mm-hmm.
So I know Emily Larson tried to call it her court. That was her idea for a new court. But we had that court like 8 years ago. So it's nothing, it's not a new concept, Mayor. So it's like, yeah, I can be kind of cynical too, so. It's no new concept. It's, rest in peace, I have to say it, to Judge Tarnowski, because her heart was in mental health, and, she was gonna be leading up this court, and it's pretty disappointing to be starting it without her, and sad, so. But, it'll probably be the people that we see, a lot of them on the street, in jail. People that have Rule 20s, that never, the competency stuff, that really never get any help. They just go, oh, you're incompetent, and then they don't give you any help, so it's like, I don't know. So, call your legislators. Yeah. I mean, I think we have a pretty good group in St. Louis County, but in Duluth, I mean, at least that I work with, I don't feel like I work with any hot shots, but, I don't know. I think that's it for now. What?
No nonsense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, thank you, everybody. Can we get another round of applause for just the vulnerability and keeping things real? Yeah, I think I have some thoughts, but I feel like I just want to hear from the audience a little bit too. Like if you guys have specific questions for folks up here, or things that are standing out for you right now. And if not, remember I have questions pre-prepared, so. Yeah.
I guess I didn't super prepare the statement, but I guess what I'm hearing from what you said is that when you have to reach out for support, it's almost like you're being like punished within that system for like reaching out for care. Like you have to like jump through hoops and you have to do all these like, I don't know, it feels like it's like you can have access, but only if it's like up this way, and it's almost like made to be an impediment.
Yeah.
Just getting like the care you need.
Yeah, I think it is an impediment. I mean, the frustrating thing is like, you need when you call for help, you want that help right now. So, we do not have enough beds for that. I mean, I didn't even touch on the shelter issue, when you're talking about beds. So, which surprises me that I did. Got too worked up, I guess. I got too worked up.
Yeah, I think there's just like common threads that I've been writing down in some of the stories you guys have shared, and thinking about, like, you know, you gave the example of like even the 4 hours that it takes for Birch Tree to get back to you, and then thinking about Airlea when you were talking about how time functions when you're in the middle of a crisis, and how like things stretch out and feel a lot longer, you know, so that 4 hours could be, so much could happen in that 4 hours that makes people either back out or feel too anxious to pursue whatever they're needing. I also think, like, in my experience, again, in the caretaker role of like helping people call places like Birch Tree and stuff like that, and like feeling like I had to put on my like previous like semi-social work hat on, like from my experience working at the shelters, and thinking about like there's verbiage that people have to use in order to get into places, and not everybody has the right words. Like when you're, you know, homeless, being trafficked, facing addiction, like facing a mental health crisis all at once, it's very hard for people to call a hotline and be like, oh, I need help for specifically the domestic violence thing, and not, you know, the other things right now. Because a lot of the time, like if you mention like at different places that have beds, if you mention too much of another issue that you're faced with, like if you talk too much about prioritizing getting shelter while you're trying to get into a domestic violence shelter, then they can turn you down because technically you're more homeless than in danger, you know, in that moment. Or you know, or if you are, you know, actively partaking in drugs as a result of the mental health crises that you're trying to like self-treat, and you call an institution for mental health, you have to have the language to make sure that they know that you're not, you know, having this psychotic fit or anything, like because of the drugs. Because if it's because of the drugs, then they're like, well, now you have to go to, you know, treatment. You call treatment, you talk too much about the mental health stuff, then they're like, no, you need to go back to like a psych ward and like take care of it that way. And so, I mean, I don't know if you guys want to talk a little bit about that.
Well, one experience that I've been having actually very recently, even in my sobriety, is housing, you know, in my sobriety. And this is also, you know, something that has to do with waiting for beds. So early in my sobriety, like Deb had mentioned, that a lot of people go to treatment and then they're turned out into the streets like directly after this. So when I went to treatment, I went to Muscalgin, and then after I did the Thunderbird halfway house, and I had asked them, you know, like I just felt like I wasn't ready when my time, you know, it was I did maybe 40 something days at MASH, and then it was under 90 days at Thunderbird Ren. And at the end of my time, I didn't have anywhere to go. I was panicking, I was freaking out, because I was like, where am I gonna go? If I get released now, as it is, I have nowhere to go. The only place that I know at this point in my life that I can go stay at is a literal trap house. So, you know, and at the end of this, I'm like, can I have an extension, please? Like, is there, and, well, that was another prevalent theme, is like in these facilities, you also deal with like favoritism, sexism, misogyny, stuff like that. So there was another man who was facing the same issue as I was, and he got an extension, and he had been staying there for well over a year at that point. So they just kept extending him and extending him and extending him. But then I had asked for an extension, and they said no. And my out date was within like a week. And I had been calling places, and I had been trying to get in places, but I didn't know who I could call. I didn't know where I was, what, you know, like, I don't know. And I didn't have these skills. I was at a point in my life, I didn't even have the skills to make myself a doctor's appointment, you know? So I barely brushed my teeth, for crying out loud. You expect me to do all these things without any assistance. So I did manage to get into like a 3/4 house at the very last minute. They just happened to kick a girl out, and I was able to move in there. Like then the T-Bird kicked me out the next day. Actually, I found the place, and they're like, all right, you can go there tomorrow. And I was, okay.
Oh my God.
So I go there, and then it's a house full of 20 other women. I'm sharing a bedroom with 2 or 3 other women, and honestly, I feel like that really shows my dedication to my sobriety, because I stuck through that. It was terrible living conditions. And as far as it goes for men, with my child's father, like he faced very similar issues with the Thunderbird. And he, you know, they made him, he had to go stay at a same type of thing with a bunch of other men in there. And that place was so bad that he had bed bugs, like, and we all as a family caught bed bugs, because that's the places that these Thunderbird, or not specifically just Thunderbird, but these halfway houses are pushing you out into. It's either they're pushing you out into nothing, where you're going to be homeless, and you have no chance of sobriety when you don't have any skills. 3 months doesn't give you a lifetime of skills. So yeah, I sat in that, I lived in that place for 18 months, I think, until an affordable housing place, with public housing here in Duluth actually opened up. And then even now, my rent is a significant amount of my income. It's almost all of my income, actually. So I do a lot of side hustles and beadwork and random stuff. But like on paper, my rent is about 90% of my income. And I've been trying to get a house with Fond du Lac with my reservation. And they say, they tell me, you know, like I've been calling them for well over a year, like begging them, like, please give me a house or something, you know, because, and then also, yeah, when I did finally get into a place after getting into that other place, the place that I got into was so roach infested that I had to abandon all my things and move over to a place that I couldn't afford with absolutely nothing. Me and my son were staying on the floor, on the mattress on the floor for months in an apartment with no heat. Like so like affordable housing is also an issue, and I think that it plays really well into this waiting for beds. So I've been dealing with this conflict with my reservation housing, which is, I'm calling them, at least once a month. Sometimes I call them every day. Sometimes I call them once a week. It just depends on how much energy I have to put forth towards that issue at the time, I guess. I've had 2 requests to address appointments with them where they ask me, like, do you think, what's your income look like? Do you have a vehicle? And then this also kind of touches on the fact that it's an impediment, because it's like, I'm not broke enough for them, I'm not broke enough for them to help me, because my rent is 90% of my income, but I have a working vehicle, so I must not be that broke. I haven't gotten evicted yet, so I might not be that broke. Well, it's a constant worry. I think about it every day of my life. I think about oh my God, this is gonna be the month that I get evicted, and I tell them that, and they don't listen because I'm not broke enough yet, because it didn't happen yet. So it's like you have to go through, and it's the same across all of these institutions and these industries, is that you have to just be in your absolute worst state of being in order to get help. And I don't want to be homeless to get a house. I'll just be broke for a while. Yeah, that's what I have to say in regards to that topic, I guess.
Can I say something in regards to that? Yeah. That's such a astute observation, because one of the things that I've really struggled with is, I am deemed a high functioning with having schizophrenia. And the thing that occurs to me is, when I was at my very worst, it was just obvious to me when I came out of the fog of the psychosis that if I don't treat my illness, I'm gonna die. One way or another, this is gonna destroy me. And when you're high functioning, that's when you can't get the help. It's when, it's like you have to prove to the world that you're a disaster to be able to get in to get services. And so it's a kind of silent suffering that you go through. And it also feels like it's like a sort of a societal conformity that you have to find a way to like appear normal in the world. Otherwise, the consequences are such that there's going to be legal ramifications, or if there's an altercation with a police officer, you get the wrong one, there's violence that occurs, someone gets hurt or killed. And so I always feel like I'm in this state of personal limbo of, like, I just feel this, I don't know, maybe it's my paranoia, but I feel this sense of fear that people can't know that I have this. And then the other thing that I've struggled with recently is, like, when you when you get diagnosed, there's these societal implications for having the label of schizophrenia put on you, because it's such a stigmatized illness, and there's almost always implication of violence. People associate schizophrenia with either that it's a split personality disorder, which it's not, it's a psychotic illness, or that there's this implication of violence. And with all the issues surrounding gun violence right now, I think psychotic illnesses are being used as a scapegoat for what's happening in society in regards to gun violence. And my personal feeling on it is we have no higher rate of mental illness in this country than any other country, and we're having different results here. So I think it's bogus to blame people with mental illness for these implications of violence. So you feel this sense of fear that if you're somehow outed, you know, and I've said this, and it's not true, but I've said to myself, damn it, I wish I would have flown under the radar and not been diagnosed, because it set up all these other problems for me in my life with this stigma surrounding it. And one of the things that, I mean, this is something that I really struggle with is I was raised in a family that hunts. You know, I hunt. You know, I haven't been deemed by a judge or a court that I'm unable to possess a firearm or anything like that, and I'm very active in my recovery, and I know when I am healthy enough to do so, and I have been for years and years, so I'm really lucky in that regards. But it's there's this implication of violence with psychotic disorders, and like one thing that should be known is that people with mental illnesses, especially psychotic illnesses, have no higher rate of violence than that of the general population, meaning that there's a certain percentage of the general population that is violent, right? And that is completely mirrored by that smaller demographic of people with a mental illness. So that just has to, I think that has to change, and that stigma surrounding, you know, the diagnosis of, say, schizophrenia, that stigma has to change. So people, because one of the things that is going to happen, I think people innately understand that that exists in our society. And what's going to happen is people are not going to reach out for help because they're going to be afraid to get that label put on them. And then they're not going to be able to get treatment, which is going to lead to all these other issues that we're talking about here today, and you know, rates of homelessness, and then dual diagnosis, which I have a family member who has dual diagnosis with chemical dependency and mental illness. He has bipolar and chemical dependency. And it just sets up this cyclical thing that all of us are talking about here today, where it's like everyone's just spinning their tires in terms of getting help, and like, how do we get on a path where we can move forward and move in a straight line towards happiness and recovery, and how do we make sure that those basic human needs are met? That's why we need the meds, so we can have basic human needs met and build that foundation for our recovery, whether it's from addiction or it's from mental illness. So then we can get to a point where we're not just in survival mode, where we can thrive and we can, you know, pursue the lives that we want to lead and create that baseline. And, you know, the question is, how do we facilitate that? How do we get that written into law? How do we, you know, make sure that legislators know that this is a priority for us? We want to build a healthier society. How do we create that social structure? And one thing I can say is I've been on this road for a lot of years. I was 22, I'm 38. So I'm not very good at math. You're going to have to figure out the year. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, thank you. Like the difference between mental health services now and then when I first got sick, this would not be happening. We would have not been talking about it at all. There were no discussions about it. I mean, and the services that were available were like fragmented and not enough. So I mean, to our benefit, I think as bad as things are, it's better than it was. And I have an aunt who has borderline personality disorder, who was experiencing bipolar and borderline personality disorder in the late 50s and 1960s. And that's another point that I want to bring up, which was in the past, in the United States, there was basically people with major mental illnesses were just incarcerated in hospitals. And I mean, this is another statistic. The people that were incarcerated in mental health facilities were made to work for free. That was part of what happened. So in the 1980s, we moved away from sort of the model of a facility warehousing bodies, and we wanted to get people back into the community. I can't remember like which administration started this. Reagan, yeah, okay, so like we wanted to get people back out into the community and not in these facilities, because obviously there's a lot of problems with warehousing human beings, and they should have independent lives and civil liberties, right? But the idea was that we're gonna provide services, community-based services for people. Well, that funding was never put into the system, so there were no community-based services for people to succeed in that recovery and lead independent lives. So that's what we have to move towards. So anyways, just popped off my head there, so.
So many thoughts. Yeah. I mean, I think too with that, it's like this trend too of like making it harder to get, and I don't know, I don't know that like specifically very safe, like perfect institutions exist for people who are going through crisis in the first place, but also with like that shift in policy, I feel like, and also in like the media, like you see like the conservatorship conversation that's happening because of Britney Spears, and so now like people who genuinely like are trying to intervene in loved ones who are, you know, in danger of harming themselves, like have less avenues to do that, because there's now like the stigmatization that like that can only be an exploitive outcome. Yeah, so many thoughts here. Hold on, let's see. I'm kind of curious if you guys, well, actually, let's see. I think I saw, yeah, you had a question.
I don't know that it's necessarily a question. So, someone not originally from this community, grew up in many different areas as also a survivor and things like that. A hope would be that our community could have multiple places that are culturally designed and developed, right? That could host women and men separately, right, to get help. Has that conversation came about in this community where there could be treatment facilities that would treat women who are survivors with addiction that could be helped in multiple ways, right? Because we know that survivors often end up with addiction, or folks who have addiction issues often end up in domestic situations. It's not often one symptom, right? There's often a cause and effect. It also happens with men or in the LGBTQIA trans community as well, where there's one action that happens, maybe an addiction, maybe an abuse, and then something falls after it. And wouldn't it be great if all of these said addictions or harms could be helped in a cultural environment? For me, for example, I'm a white passing Mexican-American woman, right? My issues are not going to be the same or helped the same as yours. We have different cultural backgrounds, but we also have a lot of similarities. If we could have like a treatment place, home, that could help transition, where women could work together to strengthen, empower, learn, adapt, to get back into society, what would that look like? Where men could strengthen family, like the state, right? Have a different, where LGBTQIA community could also uplift and do that. But then everybody could come together to, at the end, and meet and say, this is what I learned, and this is how we can come together, and this is how we can unite. Because the more we divide and separate, nothing's getting done. Just a thought. I was just thinking while you were talking, your beautiful, for sharing your stories and your beautiful achievements.
Thank you. I think that, for being kicked out of Thunderbird as quickly as I was at the end, overall, going to MASH and Thunderbird is a very spiritual program for Indigenous people. I think that a problem with that is that we just really don't have a lot of cultural diversity here in Duluth. It's mostly white people, some black people, and some native people, and honestly, I don't see a whole lot of Mexicans around either. So I think that as a whole, Duluth is moving towards diversification. Like, I have a friend who works at Denfeld High School, and she's pushing towards bringing because she's half black, so she's trying to push towards in the high school bringing step classes and things that are culturally appropriate for her culture. People definitely are making that movement, but that's something that's probably more in the future, there's some things in place now, and people are building the groundwork for these things to be successful, I guess, in the future, is what I would say.
I'm just wondering if it would help folks to better align in the area.
Yeah.
More
I think that,
positive and help that structure, right, to help
yeah,
support.
well, I hadn't been successful in the 2 previous treatments that I had gone to because I think a large part of that was because they weren't based on spirituality, or they had spiritual aspects to them that didn't apply to me as an Indigenous person. They kind of just threw me in these treatment centers and were like, you gotta believe in God, and I was like, I don't. So having something that was specifically made for me and what I grew up with and what I believe in definitely helped me. They even rewrote the steps for natives, and just all they did was replace it with the Great Spirit, the word God, but it worked in my little addict mind. I was like, yeah, that totally checks out. But yeah, so I do think that having culturally specific practices in regards to addiction is very helpful. But I also think that, spirituality looks different for everybody. My spirituality definitely involves a lot of smoking weed in the woods, to be honest. The way that I feel about connecting with my creator is being with nature and smelling the smells and listening to the waves and putting out my tobacco and praying, and that might not be what it looks like for another person. So who is a treatment center to say also how you can practice your spirituality?
I think there's a component too of prevention, how access to culture outside of those spaces leads to prevention, and how there's such a separation in access for a lot of our communities, especially when you live in a community that's mostly white folks. There's not a lot of just general spaces in your day-to-day where you can go to have the mental health care of having a social group that you can identify with and share practices with. And I think there was an artist I knew at one point or another, and I don't think he's doing particularly well anymore, but back when I'd met him, he was on this streak of sobriety, and life was going good, and he was up and coming artist, all these things. And we had coffee at some point, and he just talked to me about how the experience of he was really happy to be so involved in the culture, but then he was Native and happy to be involved in the culture, but then he was the first time I ever had access to culture was in treatment when he went to MASH or those other places. And so why is it that is for communities of color, and specifically for Native people, there isn't that access until you're in rock bottom and stuff like that? If you'd had access to that before, would it have changed the conditions? Did you have to hit sort of rock bottom? And I think too, you think of the statistic is on here, and it's talked about a lot here in Duluth about just, again, specifically to the Native community, it's 3%, roughly 3% of Duluth's entire population and 30% of the homeless population. So then there's like this, you know, overrepresentation of Native people who are homeless and connecting with different facilities, and then a lot of them like getting, again, that first access to culture in those spaces. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like another frustrating element is that cultural competency isn't really taught and can't be taught because it's like on a place-by-place basis.
Right.
Almost like each company, it's like you can teach cultural competency to your employees, but how is it gonna get done and who's gonna teach it? You know what I mean? Like, I work at an arts facility where, like, they would always have beef with the Native residents because, like, we don't make eye contact. And it wasn't until, like, I worked there and I told them, like, I was raised not to look people in the eyes. But they would get on these residents and be like, you need to look me in the eyes and, like, be respectful and be very, like, confrontational about it. And I had to tell the staff in the meeting, like, look me in the eyes if you want to fight me. Look them in the eyes if you want to fight them. That's what it is.
Like you're saying, respect me while disrespecting me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like they really didn't realize that. They were like, I
Yeah.
don't know. And I'm like, well, you don't know.
I agree. I was also taught that growing up.
Well, something that I've recently been thinking a lot about as someone who got sober through the traditional AA 12-step model. It's interesting to me because I start to connect the dots in the big picture. I was adopted when I was 5 years old. So I was raised in a Norwegian and German family. So I was so disconnected from my cultural heritage. By the time that I got into treatment and looking back and deconstructing the whole situation, I had this feeling that the whole treatment program as it stands right now is kind of curated for a white Judeo-Christian.
Very much so.
And the reason why I'm realizing that the 12 steps worked for me and treatment worked for me is because I had been programmed for years in a very conservative church. And a lot of the things they teach you in these 12-step groups about surrender and humbling yourself, before and turning over all these things to some higher power. Those things were all things that I grew up, and they were concepts that I grasped and understood and made sense to me. And I can't imagine how someone who didn't grow up in a religious upbringing, and I saw it in our treatment groups, people who they could not get with the program because they just weren't raised in that environment.
I've honestly still haven't done my 12 steps. Like, I've been sober for 6 years and I never finished the steps because they really didn't make any sense to me, and they never did, and they just didn't apply to me. And, they work for some people, but like, there is no universal treatment solution for people. Like,
But the one that gets pushed is the 12 steps all the time. That's the
and-
one you get thrown into.
I remember being terrified in my early recovery, and like they push, even like the treatment places and everything, they push these, you gotta go to meetings, and stuff on you. And it's like, have you ever seen that scene from Mean Girls where he's like, talking about STDs, and he's got the chalkboard and he's like, do not have sex or you will get an STD and die. And that's how they treat like any drug use or any like alcohol use or even some places treat cigarette use like that. As far as the 12 steps go, they tell you like, absolutely, you have to abstain. And it's kind of terrifying. Like, like if you just make one mistake, you're gonna mess up your whole life all over again, and then you're gonna be smoking an 8-ball, in a trap house under a bridge and die. And I'm like,
Yeah, don't mention harm reduction in a 12-step meeting.
No, don't say anything about methadone or Suboxone.
You're not sober.
No.
Well, I think that, as everyone's been saying, is everyone's has a different path to where they need to get for health and sobriety. But yeah, the fact is that for years, AA always says it has no political affiliation. It's it stays out of all those issues. But for years, behind the scenes, they were lobbying, rubbing elbows with congressmen in Washington. Doing all these things to try to get their method funded, paid for, and with very little research. I mean, They talk about, they say at the beginning of every meeting that rarely has anybody failed who's thoroughly followed our path. But they have no statistics to back it up. They have nothing. They can just throw these claims around. And people, I mean, impressionable people who are desperate, like sometimes that meeting that you go into is the first line that anybody crosses to try to get help. And they start hearing stuff like that. And then when they go home from these meetings after a few times and they realize, like, I'm not getting better, and you start being like, I wonder, you know, rarely have we seen anybody fail, and you're like, what's going on here?
Like,
I must be
trying hard enough.
I'm not trying hard enough. And the steps, you know, is a lot about basically everything that's gone wrong in my life somehow is my fault. That's what the 12 steps really teach. In some ways, it's good to take personally responsibility, but in the wrong person getting that messaging to them could be deadly.
I agree.
It almost was for me. So I appreciate what you're saying.
One thing that really resonated with me that you said that was, I am not an addict, which I honestly, like, the further into my sobriety that I push, I don't feel that I am necessarily an addict. I feel that I was a victim of my circumstances growing up. You know, if you've ever heard of an ACEs test, I have check every box. I got 100% on this, you know, the first test I ever passed. But you know, it's just, I don't know that I was ever necessarily an addict. I think that, you know, I had severe mental health problems and a lot of trauma that I had to deal with. And I didn't grow up in a good way, and a lot of the things that were modeled to me was alcoholism and addiction and stuff. And you know, I was also in a severe car accident, multiple actually, back to back, where I was pretty much just dosed up with pills, just never-endingly. And then suddenly cut off one day, which really kicked off the end of my addiction, which is also why my piece is, that's the plate from my shoulder, because I shattered my shoulder, and I pretty much broke every bone in my torso, actually, and still deal with a lot of chronic pain to this day because of it. You know, it's been almost 10 years since those accidents, and I still go to physical therapy, and I still have to maintain, like, diet and exercise because the pain is somewhat of a trigger, I guess. But you know, and like, as we're talking about, the AA is not one size fits all. What really worked for me was, you know, tackling my physical health, like the chronic pain that I dealt with, and tackling a lot of the childhood trauma that I dealt with, and still deal with to this day. But I've been going to therapy for 5 years now, and like I said, getting back in touch with my spirituality, finding my interests and my hobbies, setting goals for myself and achieving them, like creating a life of responsibility for myself. I have a son now, I have a truck, I have a dog, I have an apartment. It takes all my money, but you know, so these are all things that I am responsible for. I'm responsible for maintaining and keeping these things, and you know, I take pride in that. I take pride in my home, I take pride in my son, I take pride in, I have a nice dog and a nice truck, you know, and these are all things that these are all goals that I once I didn't have these things, you know. These are goals that I set for myself, and then I achieved those goals. And so, like, I think it's not really about the material aspect of it. It's about setting a goal and achieving it and giving myself that sense of accomplishment. You know, it's really just about building positive relationships with yourself and with other people. And that looks different for everybody, you know. For me, that looked like getting in shape and going to therapy forever for the rest of my life. But but you know, yeah, and you know, AA does have like a toxic mindset, and once I exited the program, I feel like that's when I really started to grow as a person, and recognize a lot of you know, start looking inward and recognizing how can I work on myself without feeling guilty or without feeling like I'm doing something wrong.
No.
Or, you know, like, just no, you can't tell me how to get better, because you don't know how to get better and I don't know how to get better, but I'm gonna try every option until I figure it out. And the options that I have or that I chose, those are the ones that work for me. And obviously you don't need AA or NA, because I've been sober for 6 years without it, and I don't even really have cravings too often anymore, to be honest.
Well, you're talking about common threads that go throughout all of this, and I think one of the common threads that, more and more, there's more and more scientific research into it too, is the effects of trauma on individuals, and then the long-term effects of trauma and how that affects the, genetic markers of what certain genes are turned on and off. And I think about, a big part of my, working through my experiences with post-traumatic stress disorder is how that's linked to my dad's experience in Vietnam and how that affected our whole family unit. And those are effects that were happening before I was even born,
So those things can be ingrained in your DNA, just like
Right.
generational trauma is for indigenous people. Like indigenous people inherently have this fear that their children are going to be taken away, because for generations before us, our children were taken away and taken to residential schools. I know that that's one big fear that I have, and so that there's things that can be just ingrained in your DNA over time.
I just have a nerdy science factoid for that, because I studied that, so
Yeah.
it's called epigenetics.
Oh.
Yes,
So,
I've heard that term.
DNA, there's a little part that sticks out that can just have a hydrogen on there, but if a methyl, CH3 gets added on, it methylates it, and the way that your DNA is expressed is different, so your DNA is the same, but that's what he was talking about with the genes turning on and off in life. So like, women who didn't get food and were pregnant and were starving started to have children whose bodies were prepared for starvation, and so when they started eating like food that wasn't nutritious, then it creates obesity in like the further generations. And so that's how like it can pass from like mother to children on through your line. It's actually like really crazy.
Yeah, I read this study about. Oh, sorry.
They did it.
Go ahead.
About how they took this group of monkeys, and the monkeys, they put the first generation monkey in the room, and they gave it a banana, and then but the next generation they put the monkey in, they gave it a banana, then the third generation or whatever, so on and so forth, they shocked it. They, instead of the monkeys grabbing the banana, like the third generation monkey grabbing the banana, it got shocked. So then like they did that for a couple of generations or whatever, and then eventually like the monkeys didn't even touch the bananas anymore, because the monkeys, it was ingrained in their DNA that the banana is harmful. So
Yeah, it's interesting because my biological mother out in South Dakota, she had eight children, I believe. My two brothers and I were her first three, and we all got removed off the reservation and in foster care, and we all were adopted by this, together. And I find it interesting how even being separated by a state, by an entire culture, by an entire, entire different existence, the fact is that all three of us had suffered from alcoholism and addiction. It didn't matter how far removed off the reservation we were. And then I find, as I'm reconnecting with them, that all of her other kids, same thing. My father had an early alcohol-related death, and my mother, she's been sober for years, but she was, had a struggle on the reservation for years as well. So I don't know too much about DNA or anything like that, but as far as my family goes, you can't point to anybody and not see someone who's struggled with addiction somehow or another. It doesn't matter where you are, how far away you run. It seemed to have caught up with. It seems to have caught up with me and my brothers, even though we weren't even on the reservation anymore, or in that culture.
do you think that there would have been anything that you could have done? Well, thinking of this like as a mother, and my son, his father and I are both addicts in recovery, but so obviously my son would be predisposed to addiction, And you know, like, we know that, but and you didn't know that growing up, but do you think there would have been anything different? Like, if anything else had happened in your life up until that point, like maybe if you knew about it, or, you know, like you had some, like if you were taught about alcoholism or something?
It's hard to say. You know, the way that I was raised, alcoholism was still considered like a moral failing. So it was more so, and being in, you know, a very conservative Christian church, morality was just kind of the center of everything. So it just kind of fell in line with all these things where good people, you know, good people don't get alcoholism or don't get addicted. People with poor willpower or who are weak are the ones that end up with addiction. And that's the framework that I had. So it was like, you know,
That's
I'm gonna fall in line. I'm just not gonna, I'm not gonna drink. And I didn't even have my first drink until I was 18. And I hear a lot of people who started when they were like 12, 13, 14. And the only reason I didn't is because I was in a really strict household. So alcoholism just bided its time and waited for me until I was ready for it. So it didn't matter. I think it was destined to happen at some point. None of us drank till we were 18. And it didn't take long for it to catch up to us.
I'm worried about that right now. I'll let you know how that turns out. My son's 21 and my daughter is 23. My dad is an alcoholic as well, and he passed away at 54. I worry about it every day, with addiction and alcoholism in our family.
Yeah.
I'll let you know how that turns out. I never tabooed it. I just always let my children taste it.
That's my plan too, is,
Especially with everything that's getting added into things these days.
yeah.
I'm
It's
like,
scary.
it can taste good and you don't know what's in it. I also am a big advocate for my son of weed. It comes from the earth. I'd rather him have that than alcohol.
That's another thing I was going to talk about, was harm reduction, because I actively smoke weed myself. I was in the medical marijuana program. My card expired. It's really expensive to get it back. But I was, and then, but I can't afford it because of my rent. But,
So with that, I just keep open communication
Mm-hmm.
and
yeah, that's what I was thinking, just letting him know, like, that, you know, that he is predisposed to such a thing, and like talk about my experiences and be open and be like, it sucks. It's terrible, you know, like, I mean, yeah, it's fun,
something I think
but then it sucks.
is when you taboo things, what happens, right?
No.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I was never tabooed from anything.
Well-
I mean, like, in society, right? The
Yeah.
more we keep our kids away from us.
Well, I think, you know, one of the big ways that I stay active, you know, outside of, you know, I haven't been to a meeting in a long time. And when the pandemic struck and they shut them down, I found that I guess I didn't need them. I just stopped and continued just doing what I was doing and doing my personal work. But I never, it's important to me to talk about, you know, I know some people feel a certain way about calling themselves alcoholic, and everyone's free to call themselves what they want. But I still use that because I think it's important to make it known that, hey, I'm not ashamed of it. I'm not going to hide it. It's not something that I need to keep hidden from everyone. And I every year I get a couple messages at 3 a.m. saying, hey, what did you do? I think I might have a problem. What did you do? And I think being open about that opens up those avenues for people to feel safe, to be like, hey, you know, it's a very humbling and timid experience to try to say, hey, I might have a problem. And to reach out to help. You're not going to reach out to help to someone who doesn't talk about it. So it's important for me to be forward and talk about my experience with alcoholism. And as far as, you know, with my son, making mental health something that we regularly talk about, getting him, you know, talking to people who care about his mental health specifically is very important. And that's, in my opinion, that's like the way to do it. Make sure that, I mean, I think everybody should see a therapist. I think everybody.
Yeah.
I think so too.
Everyone sees a
Everybody.
doctor. Why not?
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, I think every year your insurance should not only cover a physical, but it should cover, you know, they should cover you sitting down with a professional and talking about the stuff that's weighing you down.
I agree.
And I think that's one big step that could help. And in the meantime, I think it's important as parents to be present for our kids when they have questions, and to be open about our struggles so that it's not so taboo when they finally make the decision like, hey, look, maybe I need to make a phone call. And I thank my dad, you know, someday he's going to listen to this. So thank you, Dad, for being there for me when I needed you. And I want to be there for my son when he needs me.
Yeah. Good.
I just want to say thank you, all of you, for your stories and your dedication to your life and your vitality. It's been years since I've been back here, but it's the same questions. It's the same thing going on.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I wanted to come in here. And so to me, it seems like we're not asking the right questions. That the systems are still designed for us to feed upon each other. This class feeds on this class, and this class feeds on this class. And the School of Masters of Social Work feeds upon the whole thing. So somebody's got to stay sick.
Yeah.
Somebody's got to stay sick, so that we can all have a job, right? But then to fight each other,
Mm-hmm.
But I guess one of the questions that I wanted to always know is like, is there a connection to the extractive nature of the area? If we are the land, is there a connection? Because it does come back to that. It comes back to that. We're not thinking clearly and coherently or consciously if we're not thinking about the extractive nature of the area. You know what I mean? Like, what's really going on here? Because it's designed for us to sit here and have the same conversation.
Yeah.
But I don't want to have these conversations 15 years from now. I'm not going to. And ask the same questions. It's a lot of money that gets thrown into the, how much was that new cultural center at McGoshen about? 1.5 million? I don't know. How much are the social work programs?
Right.
Because it makes money.
And the halfway houses.
They're feeding upon us, and we are feeding upon each other.
Yeah, if everybody was healthy, there'd be no more clients.
So it's like, what are the clear and conscious, coherent questions that we can ask? The new questions.
That was going to be like my end question for this whole thing. So, because I mean, that, even with this show, like my frustration was like, I've been, in the local advisory committee for mental health for St. Louis County, and I've been in all these groups and boards, and like, for me, like as a caretaker, realizing that I can't change the conditions of people I love because this waiting for beds thing is happening. I was like, okay, I'll go and do like groups and join places that influence policies and all these things. And in all of them, I got all this data. And like every year, the data is just progressively worse.
Right.
And I was like, okay, maybe if I just put all the data on a thing, like make it prettier at least, so people look at it and realize that it's already been studied. Like we need to, like, not that there's anything wrong with research, but like you said, like it's consistently the same question, similar results or worse results every time, surveys and stuff go out, and the money goes into like all this research stuff. And I'm like, at the end of every report I was reading too, there's like pages of solutions. And it's the same solutions for decades of like, we need this, the other thing. And so like part of me trying to craft this space is like to have that conversation around like, I mean, like what does it take to create a culture or a society where people don't have to wait for beds? But additionally, like your question, like how do we get away from the same questions being asked over and over again, and people like being here and being really vulnerable and sharing these stories that have these common threads that are linked back to those same concerns and questions. So I don't know if you guys want to take it away.
I will take it away. I think the answer to that question is community engagement. I think that, community engagement can even, prevent these circumstances and prevent the necessity to even wait for a bed. And community engagement can also be helpful after, when you're already down the wrong road, I guess, your community actually engaging you and looking out for you and caring for you. And it's, it's not, if one person tells you you have a problem, you're probably not going to listen. You're probably going to be like, fuck off. Like, I don't have a problem, you know? But, you know, like, and it's not that, you know, you just need countless people telling you you have a problem, but you do need countless people telling you that they care about you and that they love you and that, you know, maybe come to the powwow, or maybe, you know, why don't you go visit some of our elders, maybe you should smudge, you know, or whatever, you know, just people to even healthy people to hang out with and have fun with, you know.
That makes just like one thing that makes me think of too, like specifically in this area, we've got just like, and a lot of places that are getting progressively more gentrified, and probably just like the general Midwest of like the entirety of like, like it just build it out there. But yeah, like I think of like, we just have all these breweries and this culture built around like alcohol, and like anything you do at night involves like getting drunk or, you know, drinking a lot. And
Personally, I love night hikes. I like to go run around in the woods at night.
Yeah,
but they don't.
the social spaces are like dominated by like
agree.
alcohol. And I think back to like when I worked at the domestic violence shelter, and it would be like, we used to host me and a group of friends used to host a show called Goody Night, which was another art project in and of itself. But the idea was to create like a sober, safe sort of like place to experience good art and music, like actual like quality stuff,
Like
you know,
actual
like,
entertainment.
yeah.
Yeah.
and like to offer that space like on evenings, like, you know, where like you wouldn't have this pressure or expectation to partake in all the libations of whatever. But it became clear to me when I was working at the shelter that there's so few spaces for a lot of the women who, again, like in the domestic violence shelters, they're going through the intersectionality of addiction, homelessness, the abuse, trafficking. And sometimes the moms just need a break.
That's what I was just gonna say. Like, as the mom of a 3-year-old,
Yeah.
it's you know, like, yeah, I agree. It's, I finally get a night off. I finally get a babysitter for the first time in sometimes 6 months, and then I'm like, you know, what do I want to do? Well, I don't want to lay in bed and watch Netflix like I do every other night, but there's really nowhere else to go because this city does have such a, and I think the Midwest as a whole has this culture of alcoholism is like very normalized in our community. Is like, you go down, I think there's like 25 bars on Tower Avenue.
Probably, yeah.
And, you know, it's just insane. This is one of the only things that they even offer as entertainment. And yeah, I don't really want to go watch a movie at the movie theater because I can watch a movie in my house on my TV. You know, it's just, there's not a whole lot to do, which also fuels the addiction rates, you know, boredom, inaccessibility to quality entertainment.
Well, and then like, I mean, I hopefully, I don't know if Chum does this, but I like, one critique I have of a lot of like service oriented nonprofits in the area is just like the reliance on like brewery, like fundraisers and stuff like that too, where like in my head, there's a cognitive dissonance of like, okay, we're trying to stop this.
Did you say reliance on what?
Like brewery, like fundraisers, like
yeah.
selling alcohol to support the people in the shelters and like to support the youth. And I'm just like, if the people who you are serving cannot go to said fundraiser because you have rules against them partaking in spaces like this, but yet this is how you're fundraising, like there's just
something has to change.
Yeah.
Here. Yeah.
There's clear cognitive dissonance in a lot of
also there's
things.
a lot of the entertainment opportunities that do come up, honestly, I don't go to because I just feel like a goon. Like, I don't know, I don't want to go to a 1980s themed prom, you know, or something like that. Like, it's just like,
I think they might take some heat for that one this year. There was some, I noticed some of the comments, yeah.
Like, I'm not, you know, like, I don't, you know, like, I don't want to, I want something that actually like applies to my interests, and you know, yeah. I mean, I'm in a good place where I don't really feel like I need a night out or anything, you know, like. But at the same time, if I did want a night out, I would want an opportunity that wasn't like some goony thing or a bar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so? It's exactly 4:00. So do you guys have any final thoughts on that question, or like what? Yeah. The whole thing.
I think just my final thought is that I still think that we can have multiple conversations at the same time. I think there's some
Yeah.
advanced conversations that delve more into the political side of things, the activism side of things that need to be had, and at the same time, I think about the stigma that still surrounds people with mental health issues, people with addiction. It's still prevalent enough that I think even basic conversations like this are still going to hit their marks and still be valuable to a certain degree, even as we talk beyond that into bigger solutions and more systemic problems that are feeding into this issue. But I think our culture as a whole has programmed us all a certain way, and I think that small conversations like these need to still happen, even as we tackle bigger mountains and ask tougher questions and have more heated and have conversations and disagreements and discussions moving forward. So I think there's room for both, and I thank you for bringing that up because they all need to happen. It all needs to happen.
I'd just like to say one last thing. I want to thank Miri for
absolutely.
facilitating this, and I feel very honored that she would want me to share my experience. You mentioned the term extraction in this region. I think I just want to tell you how much I appreciate your thought process on this. I've thought about it a lot myself. I don't know specifically what you're speaking to, but it's a topic that spurred a whole lot of questions that would be another 2 hours, so we can't necessarily do that right now.
I was going to say, I have a film titled Extraction that's literally playing right now over at Zeitgeist, and it's about that concept of extraction of land and how that is reflected in our extraction in people. Too,
And
so.
I think there's a lot of connection to culture from that extraction, and that's to take away. And so I appreciate that. And then I guess just in sort of final closing statements, I just feel like the conversation around trauma and healing is something that's just prevalent, and I'm grateful that people are talking about those issues and seeing that as a root source instead of seeing this as something that is to be a blame that is put upon people, or that there's a sense of shame. And then also, moving into the realm of science, of understanding the root sources of what is happening with trauma, what is happening with addiction, what is happening with mental illness, how these things are all tied in together, and how sometimes I think there is, like we talked about earlier, oversimplification of these problems that is put a lot of pressure and shame on individuals. And so far, I haven't met many people who have really grown as human beings when shame has been the central source of the issue. So anyways, I want to thank all these people here sharing their thoughts, and the people out in the audience who have shared their thoughts. It's really been an honor and a pleasure.
Well, I was thinking about shame just a while back. I'm going to age myself again because, back when I went to AA, it was very shame-based, I was the one that went every week and said, oh, I relapsed, I smoked a joint, every week. And the ladies in the group loved me anyways, And I'm still friends with a few of them today, and we're talking like 50 years almost. So, some of them have died, but I found it to be very shame-based. Even as I continued, like moving to the cities and, maybe trying to go to AA, and it just wasn't for me. So, and the harm reduction movement came along pretty quickly after I think my first time in treatment was 1975. Probably a lot of you guys weren't even born yet. So yeah. And then, the harm reduction movement, it started in 1988. So, I graduated in 78. And so, fast forward, we're at harm reduction. It was started out in Tacoma, Washington by Dave Purchase. And there's some good history in that too, but one thing that just absolutely drives me nuts though is the shelter beds themselves, because I never thought I was gonna have a career out of this. And all I do is see homelessness go up every year. More calls from families, no beds for families. Yeah, I don't know. I never was a fan of, hey, let's build more shelter. Let's build more shelter. That wasn't something that I agreed with. And now we're doing that. So, Chum got some money to expand, build up. The only part I agree with on that is that, hey, maybe we can make some space where couples can be together, because a lot of times they won't come to shelter because they can't be together as a couple. People that have jobs and want to be sober, they can be in a space that's by themselves. Because right now, I mean, the Chum is a very chaotic place, and the warming center is even more chaotic. It's like, if you ever get the chance, to spend a night volunteering at the warming center, do it in the middle of the night, because that's when you're gonna see. That's when you're gonna get knots in your stomach. I mean, that's what it's like. So, you got untreated addiction, mental health, and so it's just kind of crazy. We've had 2 deaths at the Chum this year. Had to make new policies in regards to the bathrooms. Like, we literally hired a person now to watch the bathrooms. Because you have to have staff there, That's like terribly, it's just tragic and heartbreaking, So, same staff found both people. He's traumatized, but we're dealing with overdose. I mean, not just at Chum, but in downtown Duluth, everywhere in the country, every day. So, but yeah, I don't know if you guys have heard about the Stepping On Up plan for Duluth. Has anyone heard of it? It's called Stepping On Up Duluth.org. It's on the Chum website. It's 5 social service agencies, ACO, LSS, I'm like brain dead today. ACO, LSS, Salvation Army, Chum, Loaves and Fishes, I guess that's all 5. But a plan to kind of get out of homelessness. It was supposed to start with sanctioned encampments this year. I'm here to say that's not gonna happen this year. Unless we find a space, unless somebody's willing to give up some land, so. But for me, that's not good enough. That is really not good enough, because people still have to live outside. And, we know these guys. I mean, a lot of them aren't gonna wanna live in a sanctioned camp, so, they wanna be on their own, so. And Dan Hanger made up some words in the paper about me yesterday. I mean, he quoted me without talking to me, so I don't know how many of you saw that article. That happens to me a lot, but it's fine. It's like, he wasn't too off, so. But he did get a message from me though today, so.
The amount of
And I don't know, I just, I don't want more shelter. And you know what, we're not gonna make it without housing for addicts. Like a San Marcos for people that are currently using, or should I say they aren't gonna make it. They are not gonna make it without that. People are not gonna quit until they're ready. All of us that are addicts or have had experience with addiction know that. You see all these folks running around here out on the street that they get into housing, they're there for, I don't know, 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, pretty soon they're kicked out because they're using. And it's like, no, they don't deserve to live on the street just because they're using drugs. They deserve dignity and respect, and they deserve to stay alive. So it might be any of our family members. So, I mean, I know it's a very controversial subject, but so was San Marcos in the beginning, so I think it's the only way we're gonna save lives. I mean, I know that Duluth is also talking about safe injection sites. I don't know if anybody's heard of that, and a lot of people think of this as enabling, but really it's just,
Getting them to
sure
that
people
point
don't
when
die.
yeah, keeping them alive, till they're
ready.
yeah.
Well,
Anyways, that's it. I can go on and on.
I know 2 of our panelists have to run right away, so I
What's that?
think 2 of our panelists have to go, so I think we can kind of call it here. I feel like this would be an amazing podcast, just like collectively, because we only scratch the surface on a lot of
We
this
just
stuff.
talk every day.
Yeah. And just like the diversity of experiences coupled with just like the threads that kind of held it all together, just really interesting to me. But But yeah, thank you all so much for showing up and supporting everybody as they, again, kind of shared their stories and opened themselves up to all the vulnerability that comes with that. And yeah, the show will be up through April 14th. It'll be at McRosty next in May. So round of applause for everybody again. And shout out to Duluth Stories Project for coming out here and offering to record all of this for us.
Thank you.
It was greatly needed, so.
Offering what? I didn't hear that.